has a demonstrated record of success on the economy in the minds of most voters, which they say is the most important issue. So I would keep Donald Trump as having unique strengths with respect to Biden's vulnerabilities as being an important factor here as well.
Right, and this may, of course, also be a measure of the fact that the Republicans challenging these Democratic incumbents just aren't all that well known, and definitely not well known enough to embody any kind of change.
That's right, and for many of these voters, these Senate races between a reasonably well-known Democrat and an unknown Republican are just sort of opportunities to express your default partisan preferences. When you don't know anything about anyone and you're a Democrat, you vote for the Democrat. So those young Black and Hispanic voters who are defecting from the Democrats to Trump in the presidential race, they're sticking by their default, normal, Democratic partisan political preference in these Senate races.
So here we have further evidence of Biden's somewhat unique weakness in this race. And speaking of battleground states and potential risks to President Biden, something else has happened since you last polled these battleground states in the fall that feels pretty important. You referenced it at the very beginning of our conversation. That is the fact that RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has gotten himself on the ballot in at least one of these swing states. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. hails from Democratic royalty. He wanted to run as a Democrat, but ultimately decided to run as an independent. So the assumption has been that he would pose the greatest threat to Biden. I wonder if this latest poll shows that to be the case.
It does not show that to be the case, Michael. It does show him receiving a pretty substantial amount of support. He won 10% of the vote when we named RFK on the ballot, which, if it were to hold up in the final result, would be the strongest performance by a third-party candidate since Ross Perot. But the poll did not find that Kennedy drew disproportionately from Biden voters. In fact, slightly more of Donald Trump's supporters were likelier to say that they would prefer RFK on the ballot than Biden supporters.
How do you make sense of that?
Well, there's a group of voters that voted for Biden in 2020 and leaned Democratic that no longer like Joe Biden. We've been talking about them for much of the episode, in fact, right?
Right.
Many of those voters say that they will vote for Donald Trump this November. But many of those voters who voted for Biden last time, who say that they'll vote for Trump, would actually rather vote for RFK, which makes some sense, right? They voted for Biden last time. How much can they really like Donald Trump? But as a consequence, the RFK vote is slightly disproportionately coming from people who would prefer Trump in this election, but simultaneously backed Biden quite overwhelmingly in the last election. So we're talking about a group of voters that Biden really needed to win last time, but that he isn't winning right now. So in our poll today, he's not really affecting the race, even though there are people who are pretty important to Biden last time.
So Nate, if I'm understanding you correctly, and this is admittedly pretty complicated, there's a group of voters here who voted for Biden in 2020, and either way, they're not going to vote for him again in 2024.
Not in the poll right now.
Yep. Instead, they're likely to vote for RFK instead of defecting to Trump. Is that good for Biden? Is it better for Biden in a swing state to have a voter who once was with him go to RFK instead of Trump?
So I guess I have two answers here. The first answer is, right now, Biden is not doing well enough for RFK to be a problem, because Biden is doing so badly among these people who ought to be Democrats that it doesn't make a difference whether they're voting for RFK or Trump. That said, if we can imagine a world in the future where Joe Biden hypothetically mounted a comeback, where alternately Donald Trump collapsed because he was convicted of federal crimes, in that scenario where Joe Biden was strong enough to win, like he was 4 years ago, then I think RFK might actually hurt him at that point.
Fascinating. So I want to turn to another factor that has entered this presidential race, and that is the Israeli military operation in Gaza and America's support for Israel in this war, especially President Biden's support for this war, which, as we know from covering it so much on the show, has triggered a tremendous amount of left-wing activism, especially among young voters who President Biden is struggling to win over. Does the poll reflect the conflict in Gaza as a problem for President Biden?
I think it does, Michael. You know, we focus again on these voters who have swung against Joe Biden, the people who voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election, but don't do so anymore. 13% of those voters said the most important issue to them was either foreign policy or something about war in the Middle East, like they said Israel or wars or Gaza. And almost none of those voters said that they were more sympathetic to Israel than the Palestinians in the conflict. Most were sympathizers with Palestinians. 13%, that's a pretty big chunk of the voters who Biden is struggling with, but that's a much higher proportion than it is among the whole electorate. So most voters don't seem to care very much about foreign policy or Israel, but those who do are pretty likely to have flipped.
Got it.
One thing that's worth noting is that Joe Biden's challenge on this issue is especially pronounced among voters who were either Muslim or who said they were Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. And nearly all of those who flipped said that the war in the Middle East and foreign policy were most important to their vote. Now, it's interesting because I mentioned earlier that this is still a small segment of the electorate, and despite all of those challenges, Joe Biden is still ahead in Michigan. In fact, it's the only state he leads in, even though it's the state where these voters represent the largest share of the electorate.
Wow.
So it's a great illustration of how, look, we're talking about something that clearly is affecting a sliver of voters and even a pretty substantial chunk, 13% of those who have defected from Joe Biden. And yet even in the single state where Muslim, Middle Eastern, North African voters represent the largest share of the electorate, it's still not necessarily enough to single-handedly determine the outcome.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation about this latest New York Times presidential campaign poll. And I just want to conclude by having you, as best you can, kind of draw it all together by giving us your higher level thoughts about the meaning of what you learned from this survey.
I think my high-level takeaway is that with 6 months to go, voters are deeply dissatisfied with the direction of the country and they want to do something very different than what they have now. And that's a really tough spot if you're an incumbent president who doesn't represent change. And you only really have a couple of paths to pull it off. One option is that you have to figure out a way to get Americans to be happy with where the country is going. I know we're not there yet, but we're on the way. It's the general way that you can imagine Joe Biden trying to thread a needle of a country yearning for something different without really believing that Joe Biden can single-handedly alter the course of American history. And while we've talked a lot about Joe Biden's vulnerabilities, we haven't talked very much about Donald Trump's problems in this poll, and ultimately the opportunities that may present themselves to Joe Biden as the campaign gets underway. Voters are overwhelmingly in favor of abortion rights in the battleground states. They don't like Donald Trump much either. A majority of voters have an unfavorable view of him. And to the extent that Joe Biden can refocus voters on Donald Trump's liabilities, get them to feel a little bit better about where the country's going, maybe that still offers a route to a comeback. Because as we just mentioned, many of these voters are still voting for Democratic Senate candidates, and many of them aren't even tuned in yet. It's still a long way to go. And if you really step back, Donald Trump should arguably be winning this election by a huge amount, given just how unpopular Joe Biden is, and given how many young and non-white voters have defected away from the Democratic side. If Nikki Haley was the Republican nominee, this election maybe could have been a landslide. In fact, in our last time Siena poll of these same states, Nikki Haley was posting double-digit leads in Wisconsin.
Right. Essentially what you have found in this poll, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is shaping up to be a change election, where Donald Trump is the clear change agent. But he's also such a fundamentally flawed agent of change that the question is going to become, do enough voters think he's willing to re-elect for the change? And are they willing to accept all the flaws?
That's right. You know, it's worth remembering the thing that we always mention as a caveat, but is so serious. There are 6 months to go until the election. The campaign is just heating up. There are conventions and vice presidential picks and possibly convictions and debates still ahead. We don't know how that is going to change what the electorate is focused on. But right now we know that they're deeply dissatisfied and taking it out on Joe Biden. Whether that's what they'll be thinking in 6 months, we just don't know. And the Biden campaign will do everything in its power to try and change that. I don't know what is ultimately going to happen, but I think that it at least sets out the roadmap, the playing field as we enter the heart of the campaign season.
Well, Nate, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
We'll be right back.
The less your business spends, the more margin you keep. But today, everything costs more. So smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one proven platform, helping you reduce IT costs, maintenance costs, and manual errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move to NetSuite. Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks. Head to netsuite.com/NYT. netsuite.com/NYT.
Here's what else you need to know today. In damning testimony during Donald Trump's hush money trial, Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, testified that Trump personally directed him to pay off a porn star and personally approved the deceptive reimbursement plan at the center of the criminal case. Cohen testified that Stormy Daniels' plan to publicize her account of having sex with Trump was a, quote, catastrophic threat to Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. As a result, Cohen said, Trump ordered him to silence Daniels. Cohen recalled Trump telling him, quote, just take care of it, an order that Cohen said he then carried out. Today's episode was produced by Rochelle Bonja, Asta Chaturvedi, and Diana Wynn. It was edited by Liz O'Bailey, contains original music by Alicia Itu, Dan Powell, and Mary Lozano, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley. Our theme music is by Jim Grunberg and Ben Landsberg of Bon Jovi. That's it for today. I'm Michael McGuire. See you tomorrow.
This podcast is supported by Chevron. Methane management is important to achieving a lower carbon future. Chevron is aiming to keep methane in the pipe. They're committed to evolving facility designs and operating practices, and they've trialed over 13 advanced detection technologies, including drones and satellites. That's energy in progress. Learn more at chevron.com/methane.
This episode is brought to you by CLA.
Here's your money briefing for Tuesday, May 14th. I'm J.R. Whalen for the Wall Street Journal. Your grocery bill is taking a sizable bite out of your household budget, and the rising cost of beef is a big part of it. That shifted the spotlight to chicken.
Whenever food prices go up, especially among the different meat items, chicken is always the bargain. Even if chicken prices tick up and the consumers may feel that, it's still much of a bargain compared to steak right now.
We'll talk with our reporter Patrick Thomas about what this means for your next trip to the grocery store after the break.
When it comes to planning for the future, taxes and wealth advisory tend to be viewed as two separate conversations, but some things are just better together. That's why at Clifton Larson Allen, they call it 12. Here's Clayton Bland, Chief Wealth Advisory Officer at CLA.
More often than not, all of the decision-making around the tax relationship are predicated on things that have happened in the past. An investment advisory relationship would be something that's looking at, hey, what are your future goals? How can we allocate capital to help you achieve those goals? So when we talk about 12, tax and wealth together, that's really what we provide at CLA, that combination of both professionals. It provides for the necessary information to make the decision that will have the best impact on you, both from a goal standpoint of my portfolio and also from a tax consequence standpoint of when I file my tax return.
Visit CLAconnect.com for more insights from Clifton Larson Allen. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Investment advisory services are offered through Clifton Larson Allen Wealth Advisors, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Member FINRA, SIPC.
Americans are buying more chicken.
dumb